Hey, you know what's always a good time? Being completely over the top. There are a few things as fun as exaggeration, theatricality, and just being a little extra, you know? In reacting with more energy than is required, in making sweeping gestures and lunatic expressions, in just being the most. Whether you're the one doing it or you're watching someone else, it's just plain fun. Derived from the French gay community's term, Campy, meaning to pose in an exaggerated fashion, camp has since evolved into a term, as defined by Susan Sontag in her 1963 essay Notes on Camp, for a sensibility that revels in artifice, stylization, theatricality, irony, playfulness, and exaggeration rather than content. Or to greatly oversimplify, the performance is the point. Camp is a bit of an outlier from the usual fare we cover in these videos, as it's technically only queer adjacent. The LGBT community has a long history with camp, and there's a bit of overlap due to stereotypes and other factors, but camp is not specific to the gays, nor is it technically tied to gender or sexuality. However, certain aspects of it have come to be stereotypically associated with homosexuality, and camp in itself is such a large and widely applicable trope with a large number of subtropes that it would kind of be a bigger undertaking than could reasonably fit into one of these videos to fully unpack. So the layout of this video will also be a bit of an outlier as well. What we'll be doing today is covering just a little bit of campiness in general before talking about 3 subtropes of camp that I find the most interesting. Also, if you're interested in a better understanding of camp, I've actually put a link to Susan Sontag's essay in the description if you're in the mood for a light read, so enjoy that at your leisure. For everyone else, let's get talking about camp, shall we? As I said earlier, camp is often defined by exaggerated performance, but this exaggeration differs from performance to performance. One of the most well-known examples of campiness comes from the 1960s live-action Batman, where playing up the inherent ridiculousness of the character was kind of the whole point, and it's largely what people loved about it. Adam West's Batman is kind of the platonic ideal of camp in how the entire thing comes together, and the campiness on display even inspired later Batman shows like The Bold and the Brave to increase the camp, which I personally think is a net positive for entertainment media in general. For a more queer-focused example, the movie The Birdcage has a really good example of it in Armand in both versions and also their housekeeper in the French original. The 80s were also a big time for camp, with everything from the music scene to the action movies to kids cartoons practically oozing camp from every pore. And you can still see this in things that specifically ate the time period, like Team America World Police, which despite being a parody, is really only slightly campier than the movies it's making fun of. Also, and this will probably get me some angry comments, professional wrestling is chock full of camp, which is kind of what draws people to it in the first place. If all you wanted to see was 2 people duking it out, you'd watch boxing or MMA or go to a dive bar in the night of a football game. But pro wrestling is just as much about the characters and the stories and the drawn out over the top narratives. It's just as much about the clash of personalities as it is the clash of bodies. Wrestling is fake is both technically true and also not the whole truth of it. Wrestling is a performance. You're there for the show. You also find camp in video games a lot, as big personalities are kind of a must in a lot of games. Bayonetta might be the first to come to mind, what with the fucking everything about the games right from the start, and the same goes for its predecessor Devil May Cry to a lesser extent. But Resident Evil 4 also counts as camp, considering the very tongue-in-cheek attitude the game has towards its own silly premise, as well as the fact that you went from zombie survival horror to roundhouse-kicking infected Spanish peasants through boarded-up windows and fighting a giant salamander in a lake with an endless supply of harpoons and also the shop guy, and just, yeah, this game was just full of camp. And if I started talking about anime, I'd never stop, so let me just gesture vaguely in the direction of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and you can fill in the blanks from there. Though interestingly, JoJo is something that started out on the lower end of camp before Rocky decided to fully embrace it, and the series has kind of only gotten campier as time goes on. It's also worth mentioning that, while every instance I've mentioned so far has been deliberately campy, it's also pretty common to find that campiness is unintentional as well. Tara Mooknee actually has a really good video on the campiness of the Catholic Church, and I've linked to it down below, so check that out for another look at the topic from a different angle. But to get back to the point of the video, how does camp relate to the LGBT community? Well, that's a little complicated. Camp has long been associated with queer culture as it allows people to use performance to express the inherent artificiality and absurdity of cultural norms. As queer people often exist outside of those norms, the expression of that queerness also has the potential to shock and mystify the cis-hetero majority in a way that can both endear us to them and make them question the necessity of those norms to begin with. Camp has historically been a tool of cultural outsiders, used to express their dissatisfaction with a dominant culture in a way that uses absurdity to connect to members of the majority. This is, however, a double-edged sword, as while it can lead to wider acceptance, that acceptance can often be only of a very narrow perception of the community as a whole. I think drag is actually a good example of this. Drag as performance is inherently very campy, and its purpose is to poke fun at the artificiality of the concept of femininity by exaggerating it to an often comical degree, which is very entertaining and part of what made RuPaul's Drag Race take off like it did. However, this also had the knock-on effect of overshadowing the trans community and leading to the darkly ironic outcome where there are people who respect drag personas 1,000 times more than they will an actual trans woman. Maybe if RuPaul had given any degree of a shit about trans people, that might have been different, but that's not how things turned out. Another side effect of camp is that it kind of led to campiness itself being seen as synonymous with queerness, to the point that queer coding and campiness have often overlapped to the point that the Venn diagram is just a fucking circle. I think old school Disney villains probably are the best example of this, as their creators wanted to play up their villainy by making them seem as different as possible from the heroes, which led to a great deal of queer coding and campiness being infused into the characters to the point that people really can't tell where one ends and the other begins. This is not to say that drag and camp are inherently bad, by the way. They're incredibly fun, and people wouldn't be mourning the loss of old school Disney villains if they weren't made so enjoyable by these elements. But it is still important to recognize the effects our creative choices have and to analyze why we perceive certain traits as being indicative of certain things. As always, it's important to be intentional with your decisions when making art, because whether you mean to or not, you will be sending a message to your audience, and it's important to make sure that message is a good one. Finally, for this section, I think it's important to note that things have actually changed quite a bit as queerness becomes more socially acceptable. We're seeing a much greater diversity of expression in queer art as more LGBT people are growing up and sharing their experiences through their art, and that means that camp is very much no longer synonymous with queerness in the same way, in part due to no longer really needing it like we used to. I know it doesn't always seem like it due to the extremely vocal minority of assholes who throw a screaming shit fit every time LGBT topics are brought up, even in passing, and a lot of them are currently doing their best to destroy the government because they'll do anything to hurt the people they don't like, and of course the leopards would never eat my face. But the majority of people are accepting or supportive of the LGBT community now, and even the most cis-hetero people in the world are interested in and fascinated by queer stories. So with social acceptability comes the possibility to simply tell our stories without the need for extra performance, and it's usually better to just tell them like they are anyway. However, that doesn't mean there's no place for camp, because like I said, it's very fun. Camp isn't inherently tied into perceptions of what being queer is anymore, which is good. Now we can be camp for camp's sake and tell our stories as they need to be told without really having to worry about overperforming to send a message or be more palatable. Things aren't perfect, of course, and there's still a long way to go before we can even consider taking a break from fighting for our rights, but things have gotten better. Anyway, that's enough for that for now. Let's get talking about those subtropes, shall we?
Names on the walls in faded gold, ghost of the ones who roll the dice.
Say hello to the gay stereotype. You know what I mean. The big one, the one that's been reinforced by decades of TV and movie portrayals and is probably the first thing that pops into your mind when someone says the word faggot. He's flouncy, flamboyant, limp-wristed, probably has a high-pitched voice, dresses either in overtly feminine clothing or extremely crisp formal wear, and likely talks about gay sex all the time, even though he's probably never actually been shown engaging in anything remotely sexual. Every bit as iconic and stereotypical as the butch lesbian. This is the camp gay. The camp gay is a bit of a loaded trope because it carries the weight of being basically the only TV representation of gay men for decades, which has led to, and let's be honest about this, an unnecessarily vicious hatred towards both it and the real people it's based off. That's not to say there isn't any justification for disliking this trope, because it has done real damage in the past. I've talked before about how media portrayals affect the public's perception of marginalized groups, and as I said, the camp gay was basically the only form of media representation gay men had for a very, very long time, which led to the unfortunate attitude amongst people that this is just what gay men were like, which I shouldn't need to tell anyone is obviously false. No minority is a monolith, and acting like they are is an asshole move. However, this has led to something of a backlash where more straight acting gay and bi men throw absolute scorn and derision on not just this trope, but the very real gay people that are like this, because the truth is that some men are just naturally campy or feminine, and that doesn't make them bad or lesser in any way. This attitude bleeds into media portrayals as well, as even media made by gay creators will take shots at this kind of character for the supposed crime of making the rest of us look bad. And this is on top of a lot of straight media still making caricatures out of camp gays because they're seen as acceptable targets, which I can't imagine is good for the self-esteem of people like this in real life. It may be exaggerated by entertainment media, but some guys are just camp, and that is not a crime worth punishing them for, so stop being dicks about it. All that said, there are a few important things to note about this trope. For one, not all camp gays are twinkish waifs who dress like the first dead girl in an 80s slasher movie. Quite a few of them are buff or wear leather or have other similarly stereotypically masculine features that tend to amplify the impact of the camp, and this is often used for the sake of comedy. Characters like this technically belong to the macho camp trope, which I feel doesn't need a further explanation, and you can look at the leather daddy from the Village People for just one example of this. For another, more positive portrayals tend to have them being the only sane man in a cast of otherwise dysfunctional and usually straight characters. This variant tends to have his flamboyancy be his only real quirk, and he'll ironically generally play the straight man to the rest of the cast's antics. This is one of the more common forms of the magical queer trope, which I talked about in this video if you're looking for a refresher on that, and he tends to aim his snark directly at the stupidity of the main cast. It's also worth noting that despite what I said earlier about the hatred some people have toward the trope and the fact that the characters can often be very annoying for a multitude of reasons, usually intentionally, when written with care and not just made into the butt of a joke, camp gays are often very well liked and often quite popular. My two favorite examples of this would be Leon from Fire Emblem Echoes, who's openly gay and feminine and sassy and fabulous, but is also one of the kindest, most dedicated and down-to-earth members of the cast, and Mr. Two-Bon Clay from One Piece, who's basically a walking collection of gay stereotypes and also one of the best characters in the show, and I will die on this hill. Given all we just discussed, I have two pieces of advice should you want to put a camp gay into your work. The first is to not make him the only gay man you add. Again, minorities aren't a monolith, and it's good to show some variety so people don't assume you're being a dick and saying that this is what you think gay men are. The second, and I'd actually consider this more important, is to remember to make him an actual character. Being gay and campy is not a full personality, the same way that being manly and straight isn't. Don't be lazy, write a full character. Okay? Okay, moving on.
Pull me in with perfect lies, red my face with poker eyes.
The camp straight is a man who exhibits the characteristics of a camp gay, but is heterosexual instead. Pretty self-explanatory, I know, but the confusion people tend to feel isn't in relation to the term, it's in relation to the premise itself. As I said earlier, people tend to associate campiness with homosexuality, and because they tend to think in absolutes, they tend to struggle with the idea that someone could be campy and not gay, but that's mostly heteronormativity talking. Also the Hays Code. See, up until the 70s-ish, it kind of didn't matter how feminine or stereotypically gay a character might act, they were simply assumed straight until confirmed otherwise. Again, this was due to the Hays Code, which forbid the portrayal of gay people unless they were either killed or very clearly villainized. Or both. Nowadays though, it's largely assumed that giving a male character campy trait is queer coding, even though those are two different things, and once again, that assumption relies on stereotypes. Which is why creators will sometimes create camp straight characters as a sort of don't judge a book by its cover aesop, but it's far more common to just have a character be campy and straight because it's fun, which is why they're super common in anime. You'll also get gender-inverted versions with stereotypically butch women, but that's kind of a whole different can of worms I'm not really up to talking about today. I don't have much else to say on this trope that wouldn't turn into a discussion on queer coding in general, and I want to save that for its own video, so let's move on to the final subtrope, shall we?
Take me like a deck of cards, another win for King of Hearts.
And here we are at my favourite camp subtrope. Campy combat is another fairly self-explanatory one, where a campy character will apply said camp for the purpose of kicking someone's ass. Whether they're gay, macho, or straight camp doesn't really matter. What matters is that they unleash their camp in a way that's often surprisingly effective and also incredibly entertaining. Ballet-inspired martial arts, deadly flowers, rainbow beams. The specifics don't really matter so long as it's over the top and probably a bit goofy. It's also important to note that characters who utilize combat camp are no less formidable than those who don't, and are sometimes even more so. This is also really common in anime. Campy characters and campy combat are practically staples of the medium, so it's not uncommon to find characters like Kurama from Yu Yu Hakusho, or Kirsch Vermilion with their super flower powers, or Pretty Pretty Prisoner with his magical girl themed stripping beatdown attack, or just like anytime a JoJo character summons the ghost of Bara Past to lay a smackdown on some unfortunate soul. You'll also see it in other media with dance battles or dance-themed techniques or fighting styles, or IRL with the wrestler Sonny Kiss, who was just the fucking most, and it's great. And of course, you see it in video games a lot, like the Pink Knight from Castle Crashers or Sylvando from Dragon Age 11, who is the best character and also the most in the entire game, or in People of Note with Smolder's Backstreet Boys inspired attacks, or this entire thing with Lasso.
What's happening?
I've heard legends, but I didn't think they were true.
What?
He's gone super singing.
And of course, Bayonetta. I'm technically breaking the rules with Bayonetta since TV Trope seems to think that campy combat only applies to male characters, but this is where I'm gonna have to disagree with them because camp itself knows no gender, and if you seriously look at how Bayonetta fights and try to tell me that it doesn't count as camp, then I'm going to have to ask you to step outside, friend. Anyway, campy combat is just incredibly fun, and I think more characters should use it in their work because it's a good time and it would make me happy, and what other reason do you need? So to summarize, camp is an incredibly diverse and complex trope with a lot of history and applications, and it's definitely worth exploring on your own time if you're even remotely interested. Camp's complicated relationship to the queer community aside, it's important to remember one thing. The difference between being gay and being camp all comes down to... presentation! So, yeah. Hey, welcome to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I want to give another huge thanks to my wonderful patrons for their support, especially Owen Oofs, Wisteria, Lustrous Lizard, Tetraphobe49, and On You. I know this trope was a little bit of an odd choice, but I've wanted to talk about it for a bit now, and it's nice to finally get it done and out of my head so I can focus on other things. I promise the next trope we unpack will be more directly related to the queer community, so look forward to that next month. I've got more videos in the works for May, so I'm gonna get back to work on those, and just wish you a lovely day. Bye everyone.